The summer afternoon had been warm, with a kind of languid stillness that only an English village could provide. The gentle hum of cicadas filled the air, and the scent of blooming roses and freshly mown grass hung in the breeze. St. Mary Mead, as it often did, seemed perfectly content to exist in its own little world, touched by the troubles of the outside. It was precisely this quiet, cantoral charm that made the event that was about to unfold all the more shocking. Chapter 01. The occasion was a garden party hosted by Mrs. Darby at her grand estate on the outskirts of the village. It was an annual event, one that the villagers looked forward to with a mix of anticipation and dread. Mrs. Darby, though a woman of considerable age, had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of propriety. Her gatherings were renowned for their impeccable organization, and it was said that not a single guest was ever out of place or out of step. She enjoyed her role as the matriarch of the village, and her guests, in turn, respected her for it. Miss Marple, as she did every year, had been invited to the party. She was a woman of modest means, living in a small cottage on the edge of the village. But she had known Mrs. Darby for many years, and the invitation was a reflection of their long-standing, if somewhat distant, friendship. Miss Marple wasn't one for large social gatherings, preferring instead to observe from the sidelines, taking in the nuances of behavior, the shifts in tone, the subtle betrayals hidden behind the politeness. She had an uncanny ability to notice things that others miss, small details, fleeting moments of discomfort, a glance that lasted a second too long. These were the things that intrigued her, the things that often told a far more interesting story than the ones that people actively chose to share. This year, however, the party was different. There was a tension in the air, though no one could quite pinpoint why. As Miss Marple wandered through the garden, politely accepting her tea and exchanging pleasantries with various villagers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't just the usual undercurrent of village gossip. It was something more, something deeper, more insidious. It was at the height of the afternoon. The sun began to dip just slightly behind the trees that the incident occurred. The moment, like many such moments, was entirely ordinary at first. The guests were gathered in the shaded part of the garden, conversing in small groups. Miss Marple stood with her usual quiet detachment, watching as Mrs. Darby spoke with several of the village's more prominent families. The conversation was about local affairs, new businesses opening in the nearby town, the latest gossip about the vicar's health, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on one particular individual, a woman Miss Marple had not seen in years. Lillian Farnsworth had arrived at the party. Miss Marple had only heard whispers about Miss Farnsworth's return to St. Mary Mead, but to see her standing in the middle of the gathering was an entirely different thing. Lillian Farnsworth had left the village many years ago after an unpleasant scandal had forced her to flee. Her departure had been quiet, and the reasons behind it were never fully discussed, but her return, announced and under such mysterious circumstances, voiced far more questions than answers. Miss Marple had heard enough from the village to know that people were uncomfortable with her presence, but no one seemed willing to voice their concerns aloud. They merely whispered behind closed doors. Lillian, always strikingly beautiful in her youth, had aged with grace, though there was something about her posture that suggested she was not entirely at ease. She had the air of someone who had returned, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, as though the past had caught up with her, and now she had no choice but to face it. As the conversation around her continued, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Darby's reaction to Lillian's arrival. The older woman's face tightened ever so slightly, though she masked it with a warm smile. She greeted Lillian as though they were old friends, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of something deeper, something more uncomfortable beneath the surface thought. It was then that the first break in the facade occurred. A scream of sharp, horrifying sound cut through the calm of the afternoon. It came from the direction of the large house. Koya, the guests froze, their conversations abruptly silenced, as the scream echoed across the garden. It was followed by the sound of footsteps rushing. Frantic footsteps. Sand. A few moments later, a young servant girl appeared in the doorway, her face pale and wide-eyed with panic. "There's been an accident," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Darby's collapsed. You must come quickly." Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had known the moment Lillian had arrived that there was more to this party than met the eye. But she hadn't expected something so dramatic, so sudden. Her mind, always alert, began to race. The scream, the panic hit, wasn't just an accident. It was a reaction to something unexpected, something sinister. As the guests scrambled toward the house, Miss Marple lingered behind, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the others. She knew, instinctively, that whatever had happened inside the house was connected to the things she had observed: the tension, the discomfort, the quiet whispers. There were no accidents, not in St. Mary Mead, not with people like Mrs. Darby and Lillian Farnsworth. No, this was no mere collapse. Something had happened. Something that was going to reveal more than anyone could have imagined. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Mrs. Darby was lying unconscious on the floor of the drawing room, surrounded by a flurry of worried guests. The doctor had been summoned, though it was clear he wasn't yet in control of the situation. Miss Marple observed everything with quiet intensity, her mind sifting through the details, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. The doctor, a man of steady hands and calm demeanor, was examining Mrs. Darby. He seemed unfazed by the frantic crowd around him, though Miss Marple noticed the subtle way his eyes darted from person to person. It wasn't just Mrs. Darby's health that concerned him, it was something else. He turned to the gathered guests, his expression unreadable. "She's had a stroke," he said, his voice steady. "She will recover, but it's clear that the stress of whatever happened today has caused this. We'll need to keep her calm for the time being." The crowd exhaled collectively, relieved that the worst had not happened, but Miss Marple's attention had shifted. She was no longer focused on the medical details. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the one person who was standing apart from the others: Lillian Farnsworth. Lillian had been standing by the window, her face pale and her expression unreadable. But now, as the doctor finished his examination, she seemed to sway slightly, as if she were about to collapse herself. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she grasped the edge of the windowsill for support. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The scream, the panic, the way Lillian had reacted, it all made sense now. Something had happened in that moment. Something that had set everything into motion. "Lillian," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the noise of the room. "I think you know more about this than you're letting on." Room fell silent. All eyes turned to Miss Marple and Lillian, who looked at her with wide, startled eyes. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew the truth would come to light. The game was over, and the mystery would soon be revealed. The tangled web of lies, secrets, and betrayal was finally starting to unravel. And in the center of it all stood Miss Marple, poised to uncover the sinister plot that had remained hidden behind closed doors for so long, ChatGPT said. The afternoon that followed, Mrs. Darby's collapse saw a distinct shift in the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead. The news of her sudden and alarming health incident spread like wildfire through the village, carried by the whispers of concerned townsfolk and the frantic chatter of those who had witnessed the event firsthand. Although the doctor had assured everyone that she would recover, it was clear that something far deeper had occurred. Not just a stroke, but something that had shaken the foundation of the village itself. St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to trauma, and the villagers, typically known for their stoic ways, had been deeply disturbed by the events of the afternoon. The garden party once meant to be a celebration of local unity and camaraderie, had become the talk of the village, each person offering their own interpretation of what had happened. Gossip and speculation ran rampant, filling the quiet streets, with an unease that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had seen the way the village's dynamics had shifted. No longer was there light-hearted banter or friendly exchanges about the weather. Instead, people huddled in small groups, their voices low, speaking in hushed tones about the events. Reverend Beecham sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "You're right about one thing, Liddle. It's never as simple as it seems. Mrs. Darby has always been a pillar of this community, but I've sensed a certain discomfort in her lately, and Lillian's return brings back memories of things better left undisturbed." "What memories?" Mr. Liddle pressed, leaning in slightly. The vicar hesitated, his gaze flicking to the side, as though considering how much to reveal. There was a time, many years ago, when Lillian Farnsworth was at the heart of a scandal, something that shook this village to its core. Mrs. Darby's involvement in that scandal wasn't just peripheral. She was right in the middle of it. Miss Marple's heart quickened at this revelation, and she leaned forward slightly, her attention fully fixed on the conversation. The village had always been so quiet, so seemingly unremarkable. And yet Miss Marple had always suspected that underneath the surface there were secrets that had been buried for years, possibly decades. It seemed that the moment had finally arrived for those secrets to come to light. Mr. Liddell was clearly intrigued. "And what happened?" "I've heard stories, of course, but nothing solid." "What's the real story behind all this?" The vicar glanced around, as if making sure no one else could overhear. "It's not something I like to revisit, Liddell. It was a tragedy, to say the least. And if Miss Farnsworth is back to confront that past, well, I fear the consequences won't be pretty." Miss Marple, her mind racing, knew that this conversation held the key to understanding the deeper mysteries at play. There was more to Miss Farnsworth's return than the hidden fortune or the simple desire to reconnect with the past. Something had happened years ago, something that had cast a long shadow over the village. And now it seemed as though that shadow was threatening to engulf everything once more, with the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form. Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't allow the villagers to get caught up in the rush of speculation, to follow their own flawed assumptions. The truth, as always, lay in the subtleties, the small details that everyone else missed. It was time for Miss Marple to step forward, to guide the investigation toward its inevitable conclusion. Later that evening, as the sun set over the village, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Miss Marple sat alone in her cozy cottage, contemplating the course of action she would take. The truth was close, so close she could almost touch it, but there was still much to uncover. Tomorrow, she would visit Mrs. Darby once more. But this time, it would be different. Miss Marple's patience was wearing thin, and she knew that the time had come to confront the people who had allowed the village to live in ignorance of its darkest secrets. She would not allow another day to pass with these unanswered questions hanging in the air. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was ready to see it through to the end. The truth, at long last, was ready to be revealed. ChatGPT said, Chapter 02. The village of St. Mary Mead had never been one to invite scandal. With its neatly trimmed hedges, cobblestone lanes, and rows of stone cottages, it had a reputation for peacefulness, its tranquility punctuated only by the occasional village fete or Sunday service. The events of the past few days had disrupted that peace in a way no one had anticipated. Mrs. Darby's sudden collapse, a return of Lillian Farnsworth, and the swirling whispers of old secrets had rattled the village's foundation. Miss Marple, of course, had been quietly watching from the edges of the village, observing how people reacted to the unfolding drama. She was patient, waiting for the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. The villagers had already begun to form their own theories, most of them influenced by what they thought they knew of the past. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, as always, was hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to look beyond the obvious dot. In the days following the garden party, Miss Marple spent her time quietly observing the village's reactions. The constable, though diligent in his efforts to maintain order, seemed as unsure as the others about the truth of what had happened. He had already spoken to several villagers, but his questions were polite and formal, too polite. In Miss Marple's opinion, he was not probing deeply enough, and he wasn't asking the right questions. But Miss Marple wasn't surprised. Most of the village would sooner trust appearances than dig into the uncomfortable realities lurking beneath. One afternoon, while walking through the square, Miss Marple overheard a conversation between two of the younger women in the village, Miss Evans, the schoolteacher, and Mrs. Crawford, the seamstress. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple had honed her ability to listen without drawing attention to herself. "It's all very strange, isn't it?" Miss Evans said, glancing around nervously as if to make sure no one else was listening. Lillian Farnsworth's return after all these years, and now Mrs. Darby, collapsing like that. It's as if something is going on that we don't understand, Mrs. Way. Crawford, her face lined with concern, nodded in agreement. "It's unsettling, isn't it? The Darbys have always been at the heart of things here. To think that something like this could happen in their home. People are talking, you know." "Oh, I know," Miss Evans replied. "I overheard the vicar talking to Mr. Little the other day. He seemed quite uneasy about it all. He didn't say much, but there was something in his eyes, something like guilt. I don't think he knows the whole story either." "Do you think Miss Farnsworth knows what happened to her father?" Mrs. Crawford asked in a low voice. "People have said it was an accident, but there are rumors that it wasn't. Maybe she's come back to get answers." "That's what I think," Miss Evans whispered. "But no one seems willing to talk about it. Everyone's too polite, too proper. They've all agreed to pretend that nothing ever happened. But something did." The words struck a chord with Miss Marple. She had suspected as much. The quiet village, with its veneer of civility, hid secrets that few were willing to acknowledge. And now, with Miss Farnsworth's return, those secrets were beginning to surface. After overhearing this exchange, Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the vicar. She had long suspected that Reverend Beecham knew more than he let on, and his nervous behavior the other day had only confirmed her suspicions. If anyone had information about Miss Farnsworth's father's death, it would be him, or at least he might know who else in the village was involved. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the church. The vicar was in a small garden behind the church, tending to the flowers, his back bent slightly as he worked. As she approached, he looked up, his face brightening when he saw her. "Miss Marple." He greeted her, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I didn't expect to see you today. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you, Reverend Beecham," Miss Marple replied. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," the vicar said, gesturing to the bench nearby. "Please, have a seat." Miss Marple sat down, taking a moment to observe him carefully. He was a man of middle age, with a calm, collected demeanor, and he had always struck Miss Marple as someone who held his cards close to his chest. He was well liked by the villagers, his sermons often filled with thoughtful reflections and gentle guidance. But Miss Marple had long suspected that beneath that pleasant exterior lay a man who had seen, perhaps been involved in, more than he let on. "I wanted to ask you about the events of the other day, Reverend," Miss Marple began, her tone light but pointed. "The garden party, Mrs. Darby's collapse. It's all left the village in quite a state, hasn't it? Reverend Beecham shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as though to steady himself. It has. Yes. It's been an unsettling few days. Mrs. Darby has been a pillar of this village for as long as I can remember. See her in such a state. He trailed off, his gaze distant. Miss Marple watched him closely. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way he seemed to carefully choose his words. I understand. It must be difficult for you, Reverend, Miss Marple said gently. But I must ask, what do you know about Lillian Farnsworth's return? The village seems quite... unsettled by it. The vicar hesitated, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle flicker of unease that passed over his face. Lillian's return. It's not something I expected, he said slowly. But I suppose one can never predict the twists and turns of life, can one? She left under unfortunate circumstances, and he broke off, his hands fidgeting slightly. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the unease in his posture. In those circumstances, she prompted quietly. What happened when she left? When she left? The vicar paused again, his gaze dropping to the ground as though searching for the right words. There were rumors, he said at last. Unpleasant rumors about Miss Farnsworth's father. It was a difficult time for everyone involved, especially Mrs. Darby. I don't know all the details, but there was talk of a business deal gone wrong. Money was involved. And then there was the accident. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression soft but insistent. An accident. Yes, the vicar said quickly, his voice growing firmer. At least, that's what we were told. But some of us suspected there was more to it. But we were never able to prove anything. And I suppose, over time, we all learned to accept the official explanation. Miss Marple nodded, though her mind was racing. The words the vicar had used were telling. Rumors, suspicion, an official explanation. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still so much left unsaid. Reverend Beecham, Miss Marple said, softly, her voice gentle but filled with understanding. Do you think it's possible that Miss Farnsworth is back to uncover the truth about her father, about what really happened all those years ago? The vicar's eyes widened slightly, and he quickly looked away. I don't know what she's come for, Miss Marple, he said, his voice shaky. But I fear it may be more than any of us are prepared for. Miss Marple stood up, her face calm, but her mind sharp. I think you're right, Reverend. It's always more than we expect when the past finally catches up with us. As Miss Marple left the church, her thoughts were already turning toward the next step. The vicar had confirmed what she had suspected. The death of Miss Farnsworth's father had never been fully explained, and the villagers, including Mrs. Darby, had spent years hiding the truth. But Miss Marple knew that the truth would come out, no matter how long it took. It always did. The pieces were almost in place, and soon Miss Marple would be ready to confront the people who had buried the secrets of St. Mary Medand, to uncover the truth behind the long-ago tragedy that had shaped their lives. The morning after her conversation with Reverend Beecham, Miss Marple sat at her cottage, contemplating the new revelations. The village's peace, so long maintained, was now under siege. The death of Lillian Farnsworth's father, buried under years of secrecy, was starting to resurface, and with it, the suspicion that Mrs. Darby, once so firmly entrenched in the village's social order, had been hiding more than just an accident. Miss Marple's instincts had been correct. The vicar's discomfort at discussing the past, his reluctance to give full details, told her that there was much more to the story than he was willing to admit. The official narrative van accident, plain and simple, didn't sit well with Miss Marple. The villagers, polite as ever, had been willing to accept it. But Miss Farnsworth's return had brought all those repressed memories back to the surface. The question now was, who stood to gain from keeping the truth hidden, and why? Miss Marple had a theory. She didn't think Mrs. Darby had acted alone in covering up the death. She was too well aware of how the villagers interacted, the way they protected each other's secrets in a strange, collective bond. There were others who knew, perhaps too well, the details of what had happened all those years ago. The question was, who and why they hadn't spoken up. A sharp knock on the door broke Miss Marple's thoughts. As she rose slowly, still mulling over the puzzle that had presented itself, and opened the door to find Constable Hawkins standing on her doorstep. He was holding his hat in his hands, his expression unusually serious. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the constable said, his voice tight. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Constable," Miss Marple replied. "Please, come in." Hawkins stepped into the cottage, his brow furrowed. "I've been to see Mrs. Darby," he began, his tone heavy. "I had a feeling something wasn't right. She seems to be avoiding questions about the past, but I can't shake the suspicion that there's more going on." "Something doesn't add up," Miss Marple nodded, offering him a seat at the small table. "Tana, I've been thinking along similar lines. Mrs. Darby's reaction to Lillian's return is more than just surprise. It's discomfort, and it's deeper than that." "What did she say when you spoke with her?" "She was evasive," Hawkins admitted, sitting down heavily. "I asked her directly about Lillian's father, about what happened, okay? She claimed it was a simple accident, that there was no mystery to it. But when I pushed her, just a little, she started to shut down. She became nervous, even agitated. It's clear she doesn't want to revisit that time." "Of course not," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes narrowing with thought. "The more someone denies, the more they try to bury something, the more likely it is that there's something worth uncovering." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I've got a feeling in my gut, Miss Marple. Something isn't right about this whole thing, and the way the villagers are reacting. They all seem to know something, but no one wants to talk about it. It's like a shadow hanging over everyone." "That's because the truth is too dangerous for them," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "The secret they're keeping is one that could destroy their reputations, perhaps even their very way of life here in St. Mary Mead." Hawkins looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "I believe Mrs. Darby, for all her outward composure, is hiding something very serious. And I think there are others in the village who know exactly what happened and are too scared to speak up." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Hawkins was listening intently, but his expression remained troubled. "I think we're dealing with more than just a cover-up," Miss Marple continued. "I suspect that Mrs. Darby may have been involved in more than just a simple concealment of facts. I think she may have been involved in something far darker, something that, if exposed, would destroy her standing in this village." Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're saying Mrs. Darby could be involved in more than just hiding the truth? That she might have had a hand in the death?" "I think it's possible," Miss Marple said calmly, "but I'm not yet ready to make such an accusation. What we need are answers. We need to understand why she would go to such lengths to protect herself and what she's so desperate to keep hidden." Hawkins nodded slowly. "I'll keep pressing her, but I don't think she's going to break easily. She's clever, and she's good at deflecting questions." "You'll need to be patient," Miss Marple said. "These things take time, but I suspect we're not looking at a single culprit. I think the answer lies in a network of people who have all been involved in some way, each with their own motives." Hawkins ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "I don't know if I can get to the truth if no one's willing to speak up." Miss Marple stood, walking over to the window and gazing out at the quiet village. "People talk, Constable. They always do. But they don't speak up all at once. It takes someone willing to listen, someone who can hear the truth hiding behind all the lies. I've seen it happen before. This village has its secrets, but it also has its weaknesses. Hawkins raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, Miss Marple turned back to face him, her eyes sharp. Mean that people can only keep their secrets for so long. If you push hard enough, if you keep looking in the right places, the truth will come out. It always does. The constable looked at her for a moment, then nodded. I'm going to need your help on this, Miss Marple. If you're right, and Mrs. Darby is hiding something, it's going to take more than just my questions to get to the bottom of it. I will help, Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering. But we'll need to be careful. We must approach this carefully, without rushing to conclusions. I believe the key to this mystery lies not just in the facts we know, but in the way the village has responded. Hawkins stood up, his expression resolute. I'll continue my work with the villagers. Maybe someone will crack. But we need to figure out where Mrs. Darby fits into all of this. The truth is somewhere inside that house. It's just a matter of finding it. I agree, Miss Marple said. And I have a hunch that our next step should involve a conversation with Mrs. Darby herself. She may be hiding behind a facade of illness, but I believe she is far more capable than she's letting on us. Hawkins left her cottage. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the fire, her thoughts once again turning to the mystery at hand. She had learned enough to be certain of one thing: the surface appearance of innocence in St. Mary Mead was just that, an appearance. Behind the neat cottages, the polite smiles, and the well-manicured gardens, there was a dark history. A history that had been concealed for far too long. Miss Marple's mind raced with possibilities. Who, besides Mrs. Darby, had been involved? How far did the web of deception spread? And, most importantly, what was it about Lillian Farnsworth's return that had set everything into motion? The village had only just begun to confront the truth, and Miss Marple knew that it would not be an easy process. There would be more twists ahead, more revelations, and, inevitably, a final confrontation. But she would be ready for it. After all, it was in these moments, when everything seemed to be falling apart, that Miss Marple shone brightest. Tools ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. Chapter 03, The Village of St. Mary Mead, once again, returned to its outward semblance of calm. The sun dipped low behind the village's neatly trimmed hedgerows, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. But, despite the quiet serenity of the evening, Miss Marple knew better. Something had been set in motion, and nothing would remain as it once was. Mrs. Darby's collapse, though medical in nature, was not the heart of the matter. It was only the beginning of something far deeper, and Miss Marple had begun to connect the dots that everyone else had overlooked. The constable, though diligent, seemed to have a rather narrow view of the situation. He was piecing together fragments of a larger story. But Miss Marple knew that without the right focus, his conclusions would be incomplete. The village had its fair share of secrets, and what had transpired over the past week was no accident. The death of Miss Farnsworth's father, the return of Lillian Farnsworth, and Mrs. Darby's increasingly erratic behavior were not unrelated events. They were threads in the same tangled web. Miss Marple had always trusted her instinct, ability to read the smallest gestures and the faintest changes in tone. It was this quiet power of observation that had led her to the heart of so many mysteries. As she sat by the fire that evening, mulling over what she had already learned, she found herself reflecting on one detail, the smallest clue that no one else had noticed. There had been something in the way Mrs. Darby had reacted when she first spoke to Miss Marple, something subtle, yet significant. It had struck her then, and now, in the quiet of the evening, it became clear. It was not Mrs. Darby's reaction to Miss Farnsworth's return that had been telling. It was her response to the mention of Lillian's father's death. Her unease, the sudden defensiveness that had emerged when Miss Marple had broached the subject, was telling. There was more to that death than just an accident. Miss Marple was sure of it. The facts that had been presented to the public didn't add up, And if there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that when something didn't add up, hey, there was always something hiding in the details. Miss Marple was so absorbed in her thoughts, that she didn't notice the light knock on her door until it came again, more insistent this time. Startled, she rose and opened the door to find a familiar figure standing in the doorway. Miss Cutts, the local spinster. Miss Marple, Miss Cutts said, her voice trembling slightly. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I need to speak with you. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Miss Cutts, though not an unfriendly woman, was typically quite reserved. Her presence was rare at this hour, and the distress in her voice was palpable. Of course, Miss Cutts, Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to allow her into the small, cozy cottage. Please, do come in. What seems to be troubling you? Miss Cutts hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though weighing whether she should continue. Her eyes darted around the room, as though making sure no one else could overhear her. Words? I don't know how to begin, she said softly. But I feel that you're the only one who might understand. Miss Marple motioned for her to sit, her expression open and patient. Take your time, Miss Cutts. I'm listening. The older woman sat down hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was still wearing her gardening gloves, as though she had been out in the garden before coming to Miss Marple. It's about Lillian Farnsworth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded, her interest piqued. I see. What about her? Miss Cutts looked up, her gaze shifting between Miss Marple's face and the window, where the last traces of the evening light were fading. I've known Lillian for many years, she began slowly, her voice low and steady. When she left the village, there was a great deal of speculation. We all thought she was involved in something to do with her father's death, but no one ever talked about it openly, not even Mrs. Darby. Miss Marple's heart quickened at this. She had suspected as much. The silence surrounding Lillian's father's death had been deafening. People had whispered, of course, but no one dared speak the truth aloud. Mrs. Darby had been at the center of it. Of that much, Miss Marple was certain. Do you know what happened to him? Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone casual but insistent. She knew that Miss Cutts had information. She could see it in the way the woman's hands fidgeted. In the nervous way, she glanced away when the subject came up. Miss Cutts shook her head, her expression pained. I don't know for certain, she replied quietly. But I do know that there were disagreements between Mrs. Darby and Lillian's father. See, money was involved, you see. But what happened after? That's the part no one ever talks about. Lillian came to me once, after she left, and told me, ... Miss Cutts stopped herself, glancing around the room again. Miss Marple didn't press her immediately, but waited patiently for her to continue. Finally, Miss Cutts took a deep breath and spoke, her voice trembling. She told me that her father had found something hidden in the village archives, something that would have exposed the Darbys for what they were. But before he could reveal it, he died. Miss Marple's mind raced. The hidden fortune, the archive, the connection to Mrs. Darby was all starting to come together. But there was more. She could feel it, a final piece that had yet to click into place. And you think Mrs. Darby was involved? Miss Marple asked carefully, watching Miss Cutts closely. I don't know, Miss Cutts whispered, but I've seen the way she behaves, the way she reacts to Lillian's return. It's not just fear, Miss Marple, it's guilt. I've seen it in her eyes. She knows something, and I think Lillian knows too. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her mind working quickly to process the information. You said Lillian spoke to you after she left. What did she say exactly? Miss Cutts paused, her eyes filled with sadness as she recalled the conversation. She told me she would come back one day to find out the truth. She said she would never stop looking for it, no matter how long it took. didn't think much of it at the time. But now, with everything that's happened, ... Miss Marple nodded, her mind beginning to piece this story together. I see. And now, Lillian has returned, and you believe she's here to uncover the truth about her father's death. Miss Cutts bit her lip, looking uneasy. Yes, I think so. And I think she knows more than we realize. If she can find what her father discovered before he died, it could change everything. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. The threads were tightening now, the mystery taking shape in her mind. There were far more questions than answers at this point, but Miss Marple could see that Lillian Farnsworth had returned not just to reconnect with old friends, but to unravel the tangled web that had kept the village in the dark for so long. Thank you, Miss Cutts, Miss Marple said gently, her voice calm. You've helped me understand much more than I had before. I will take your words into consideration, okay? As Miss Cutts left, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching her retreating figure, okay? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the answers were still out of reach. There were secrets to uncover, connections to make, and people to confront. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would visit Mrs. Darby again. She was certain now that the woman knew more than she had admitted, and when the truth finally came out, it would be a revelation that would shake St. Mary Mead to its very core. But for now, Miss Marple was content to wait, to watch, okay, and to listen. The game was far from over, ChatGPT said. Miss Marple had never been one for rushing. Her method was always measured, her observations careful. But after hearing Miss Cutts' revelation, she felt the weight of time pressing against her. The pieces were falling into place, but they were scattered disjointed. It was now time to pull them together, one careful move at a time. And that meant going directly to the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Darby's estate was as imposing as ever. The hedges trimmed with military precision, the garden laid out in a geometric pattern that reflected her sharp mind. The stone walls of the manor seemed to stand like sentinels, guarding secrets that had been buried long ago. It was in this imposing space that Miss Marple had decided to confront the woman who held so much of the village's past in her hands. Miss Marple was not naive enough to think that Mrs. Darby would open up easily. She was a woman who had spent years building her reputation, and she would not risk losing it without a fight. But Miss Marple had her own weapons, patience, observation, and an uncanny knack for knowing when someone was hiding the truth. As Miss Marple entered the drawing room, she could see Mrs. Darby standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling estate beyond. The room smelled of roses and old books, a scent that always reminded Miss Marple of things long past, things people tried to forget. Mrs. Darby turned as Miss Marple entered, her face maintaining the cool, composed expression that had become her trademark. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby greeted her, her voice pleasant but sharp. I wasn't expecting you today. I trust you were well. I am, thank you, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and composed. I was in the neighborhood, and I thought it might be a good time to have another conversation. After all, so much has happened since we last spoke. Mrs. Darby's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. A great deal has happened. Quote, I'm sure you're aware of the situation. I'm doing my best to recover from the shock of the other day. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. Of course, but I'm not here to discuss your health, Mrs. Darby. I'm here because I believe there are things that still need to be said. Things that I suspect you have been trying very hard to keep hidden. For a brief moment, Mrs. Darby's expression tightened, the smallest crack in her armor. It was barely noticeable, but Miss Marple had seen the flicker of something, nervousness that could not be disguised. She was on the right track. I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said, her voice stiff now. But I assure you, I have nothing more to say about Miss Farnsworth or her father. What happened was tragic, yes, but it is in the past. Is it really though? Miss Marple asked softly. The past has a way of coming back to us, doesn't it? Especially when we least expect it. Mrs. Darby's eyes flashed, a look of genuine unease passing across her features before she masked it with a thin smile. I'm afraid I don't follow you, Miss Marple. I'd told you everything I know. There's nothing else to say. Miss Marple studied her closely. There was something in Mrs. Darby's voice, a shift, an edge to the words that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but Miss Marple had learned to notice such things. The woman was lying, and Miss Marple knew it. But why? I believe you're hiding something, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said quietly. Her voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. I believe you know exactly what happened to Miss Farnsworth's father, and I believe you were involved. For a long moment, the room was silent, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle taking place within Mrs. Darby. Her hands, which had been folded neatly in front of her, trembled ever so slightly. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple noticed. She had seen it before this moment of weakness, when a person could no longer keep up the facade. The truth, as always, was clawing its way to the surface. Finally, Mrs. Darby broke the silence. You have no idea what you're talking about, she said, her voice trembling now, a mix of fear and anger. You have no idea what's at stake. Here, I did what I had to do. You don't understand the pressures I was under. Miss Marple stood still, her gaze unwavering. I understand perfectly, Mrs. Darby. You were protecting yourself, weren't you? You were protecting your position in the village. But it's all coming undone now, isn't it? Farnsworth is back, and she's not going to rest until she uncovers the truth. Mrs. Darby's face paled, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the full weight of her guilt in her eyes. Please, Mrs. Darby whispered, her voice breaking. Please don't make me go through this again. I never meant for any of this to happen. Miss Marple's voice softened, her tone gentle yet firm. It's never too late to face the truth, Mrs. Darby. It's never too late to stop hiding. The older woman closed her eyes for a moment, as though steeling herself. When she opened them again, her expression had shifted. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a sense of resigned acceptance. She knew that Miss Marple had found the truth, and there was no denying it anymore. I had no choice, Mrs. Darby said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband, he was involved in something terrible. And when Lillian's father started asking questions, we couldn't let him find out. We couldn't let anyone find out. Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding now what had happened. The death of Lillian Farnsworth's father had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act, planned and executed to protect the Darby family's wealth and power. Lillian's father had uncovered something that could have destroyed everything, something that had involved Mrs. Darby's late husband. And in the end, Mrs. Darby had been forced to make a choice. The consequences of that choice had been far-reaching, but now, it seemed, they were coming home to roost. I didn't want him dead, Mrs. Darby continued, her voice trembling. I just wanted him to leave, to stop asking questions, but he wouldn't. And then, ... Miss Marple waited patiently, letting the silence stretch out. She knew the woman needed to say it herself, And finally, Mrs. Darby spoke the words that Miss Marple had been waiting for. We poisoned him, Mrs. Darby said, her voice hollow with regret. We poisoned him and made it look like a heart attack. It was the only way to keep everything intact. Miss Marple stood still, her mind processing the revelation. There it was, the truth, finally laid bare. The death of Lillian Farnsworth's father had not been an accident, but a carefully planned murder executed to protect the Darby family's legacy. The poison had been subtle, insidious, and effective, just as they had intended. But it was also the beginning of the end. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked at Mrs. Darby, who now seemed a shadow of the proud woman she had once been. And now the past is catching up with you, Miss Marple said softly. You can't run from it anymore. Mrs. Darby's shoulders slumped, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. I never wanted any of this. I thought it was over. I thought I had gotten away with it, okay? But now, it's all coming undone. It always does, eventually, Miss Marple said quietly. The truth always finds its way to the surface. And, with those words, Miss Marple knew that the final chapter of this mystery was nearly written. The web of lies that had been spun so carefully over the years was unraveling. And it was only a matter of time before the full extent of the Darby's involvement was revealed to everyone. Village would never be the same. But for Miss Marple, the satisfaction lay in the quiet certainty that justice, however, Gase, was finally being served. The truth had been uncovered. Now it was time for the consequences to follow, ChatGPT said. Chapter 4. The revelation from Mrs. Darby had sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. But as the evening drew on, a new sense of urgency replaced the stillness that had gripped her earlier, the quiet satisfaction of unraveling a mystery, the satisfaction that Miss Marple had often felt in her years of solving cases, was now tempered by the realization that there was more to this story than she had first imagined. Mrs. Darby's confession, the revelation that the Darby family had been involved in the death of Lillian Farnsworth's father, was merely the surface layer of something much deeper. As Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, reviewing the details, a thought struck her, something that had been present in the back of her mind, but hadn't fully surfaced until now. She had initially assumed that Mrs. Darby had been acting out of a desire to protect herself, her reputation, and her wealth. But what if there was another reason? What if the Darby family had been covering something even darker, something that went beyond self-preservation and into the realm of power, influence, and control? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more convinced she became that there was something else at play. The Darby family, for all their wealth and influence, had been hiding more than just a murder. They had been hiding a deep, systemic lie, one that reached far beyond the confines of St. Mary Mead. The sound of a soft knock on the door broke her concentration. Miss Marple rose, her thoughts momentarily distracted, and opened the door to find Constable Hawkins standing in the doorway, looking more troubled than usual. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, I've been to see Lillian Farnsworth. She's not in the village anymore. In fact, she's gone, disappeared, just like that. I can't find her anywhere. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had known that Lillian's return to the village was no mere visit, but to hear that she had left so suddenly, without a word to anyone, well, it was unsettling. Miss Marple's instincts were already on high alert. She had always trusted Lillian's motives, but now there was a new question to consider. Why had she left? When did you last see her? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. Just this morning, Hawkins replied. I went to check on her, to see if she had any information to add to the investigation. She wasn't at her cottage, the landlady told me. She had packed up and left early this morning without saying where she was going. Miss Marple's mind immediately began to piece together the possibilities. Lillian Farnsworth, after all her calculated return and the confrontation with Mrs. Darby, had now disappeared. It could mean one of two things. Either she had found what she was looking for and decided to leave before anyone could stop her. Or, more troublingly, someone had forced her to leave. Did she leave any message? Miss Marple asked, her voice now more urgent. No, nothing, Hawkins replied. Just vanished. I spoke to the villagers, but no one knows anything. It's as if she was never here. There's no sign of struggle, no sign of anything unusual. she just packed up and left. It doesn't make sense. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. I believe I know what's happening, Constable. Lillian has uncovered something more than we initially realized, and now someone is trying to stop her from exposing the truth. Hawkins frowned. Stop her? What do you mean? Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her eyes intense. I don't believe her. Departure is voluntary. Lillian Farnsworth has found something. I don't know what exactly, okay, but I'm certain it's related to her father's death. More importantly, to what Mrs. Darby has been hiding all these years. Hawkins shook his head, clearly frustrated. But why would she leave without telling anyone she found something? Why not confront Mrs. Darby or come to you? 'Cause, Constable, I suspect Lillian found the final piece of the puzzle. She might have uncovered a detail that tied everything together, something that people in this village would do anything to keep hidden. The Darbys aren't just covering up a murder. Take their legacy, their influence, and the lies they've built their lives around. But why leave? Hawkins repeated. She could have used that to get justice. Not if she's being watched, Miss Marple replied. Lillian was smart. She knew there were forces at play that she couldn't face directly. She left to protect herself and to make sure that the truth would be the last thing people saw, not the first. The constable looked bewildered. You think someone's trying to silence her? Miss Marple nodded slowly. I do, Kay, and I think that someone is Mrs. Darby. Hawkins stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowed. For why would Mrs. Darby? Because she's not just protecting herself, Miss Marple interrupted gently. She's protecting a much larger system. If Lillian found what she was looking for, she uncovered a piece of evidence that could bring down the Darbys. There are people who will go to any length to make sure it stays hidden. Hawkins's face tightened with concern. So what? Now, do we go after her? Miss Marple paused, considering. No, not yet. We need to tread carefully. Whoever's involved in this will be watching every move we make. Key is to stay patient, to let them believe we've lost interest. Hawkins seemed unconvinced. That doesn't sound like a good plan, Miss Marple. Miss Marple offered him a small smile. It's not the plan, Constable, that matters, is how we execute it. We wait, we observe, we listen to the right conversations, and we keep our eyes open for the smallest clues. Lillian Farnsworth may be out of the village, but she hasn't disappeared completely. She's left behind something we can find. Hawkins exhaled, frustrated but resigned. I still don't see how we're supposed to find her if she's gone. Miss Marple turned to the window, her gaze distant. Because, Constable, people always leave traces. No one can disappear entirely. Lillian's gone. It's because she's discovered something that someone wants to keep hidden. Sooner or later, that truth will come back to us. Hawkins nodded, though he still looked uncertain. And how long do you think we'll have to wait? As long as it takes, Miss Marple said softly. Okay. The truth is patient, and so am I. The constable left, still uncertain, but willing to follow Miss Marple's lead. She, in turn, settled back into her chair, the puzzle still taking shape. In her mind, Lillian had uncovered something significant, something dangerous enough to make her run. But that would only mean one thing: she was close. Closer than anyone realized. And now, with the game beginning to shift, Miss Marple was more determined than ever to see it through. Miss Farnsworth's disappearance, though alarming, was merely the next chapter in a story that was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. And Miss Marple knew that the final twist was yet to come. ChatGPT said. The disappearance of Lillian Farnsworth had shaken St. Mary Mead to its core, casting a long, uneasy shadow over the village. It was as if the earth had shifted beneath their feet, and now the villagers were left to try to make sense of a reality that no longer felt familiar. Miss Marple, ever observant and patient, knew that the path forward was fraught with danger. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. The disappearance wasn't a result of fear or desperation, but a calculated move by Lillian herself, a way of luring her pursuers into the open. What troubled Miss Marple most was the knowledge that the village was quietly divided. People were beginning to take sides, even if they weren't fully aware of the stakes. Some, like Miss Cutts, had remained quietly supportive of Lillian, while others, particularly the older, more established families, were visibly uncomfortable with her presence and the stir her return had caused. But despite the undercurrents of tension, no one had yet connected the dots. They still didn't know the full truth, and Miss Marple knew that until they did. The village would remain in a fragile balance of suspicion and silence. The more Miss Marple considered the situation, the more she realized how important her next step would be. The Darby family, despite the shock of the revelation about Mrs. Darby's involvement in Lillian's father's death, was still at the heart of everything. Mrs. Darby might be physically incapacitated, but her influence remained. The cover-up of the murder, the secrecy surrounding it, had been expertly executed over the years. And it was no coincidence that Miss Farnsworth's sudden return had set off a chain of events that threatened to tear it all apart. Miss Marple spent the following days quietly observing the villagers. Their interactions, once predictable and calm, had become fraught with unspoken tension. The question of Lillian's disappearance was on everyone's lips, though no one dared speak it aloud. There was a certain tension in the air, a feeling of something left unresolved. And Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before someone would crack under the weight of their silence. One afternoon, as Miss Marple walked down the cobbled street to the village store, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the corner of the lane. It was Mrs. Crawford, the seamstress, who was known for her sharp eyes and quick tongue. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration as she spoke in a low voice to another woman, Miss Evans, the schoolteacher. Miss Marple, ever the observer, slowed her pace as she approached, keen to hear the direction their conversation was taking. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mrs. Crawford," Miss Evans said, her voice low and filled with concern. "All this talk about Lillian Farnsworth, and now she's gone. What if she knows something she shouldn't? What if she's figured out the truth about her father's death?" Mrs. Crawford nodded gravely, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been thinking the same thing, Miss Evans. We all knew there was something fishy about Lillian's father's death, but no one ever dared speak of it, okay? And now that she's back, asking questions, it's like opening old wounds. Do you think Mrs. Darby had something to do with it?" Miss Evans asked hesitantly. Mrs. Crawford's eyes flicked around, as though making sure no one else was listening. She leaned in closer. "I've been around long enough to know when people are hiding something," she whispered. "And I'll tell you this, Mrs. Darby's been hiding something for years. I don't know what exactly, but I've heard enough to know it wasn't just an accident. There's more to the story. Much more." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she listened. Mrs. Crawford was right. The Darby family's role in Lillian's father's death was at the heart of the mystery. But the deeper question was why Mrs. Darby had worked so hard to keep the secret buried. What had she truly been trying to protect? As the two women continued to converse, Miss Marple kept her distance, carefully cataloging the information they shared. Mrs. Crawford's suspicions were far from new. Many in the village had whispered about Mrs. Darby's role in the death, but no one had ever dared to confront her openly. Yet now, as the mystery deepened, it seemed that more and more people were beginning to put the pieces together, and Miss Marple, with her quiet observations, had been able to see something that others had missed. Later that evening, Miss Marple made her way to the Darby estate. She had already visited Mrs. Darby once, but she had more questions now. Discovery of the truth about Lillian Farnsworth's father's death had unsettled many in the village, and Miss Marple needed to understand just how far the Darby family's involvement went. If the village were to heal, the entire truth needed to come to light. When Miss Marple arrived at the estate, the house seemed strangely quiet. The usual bustle of staff and activity had slowed to a halt, and the windows were darkened, as if the house itself were in mourning. Miss Marple approached the front door, where she was greeted by the housekeeper, who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and weariness. "Miss Marple, is it?" the housekeeper asked politely, though her tone lacked the usual warmth. "Mrs. Darby isn't seeing anyone today. She's still unwell." "I understand," Miss Marple said softly, her voice kind but firm. "But I must speak with her. It's important." The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the closed door of the drawing room. After a moment's pause, she nodded. "I'll let her know you're here." Miss Marple waited in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room felt colder than it had before. Mrs. Darby's absence had left a strange stillness in the air. Miss Marple could feel the tension seeping from the walls, as if the very house was holding its breath. A few moments later, the door creaked open and Mrs. Darby entered. She was not the proud, composed woman Miss Marple had once known. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with worry. She looked older, wearier, stripped of the confidence that had once been her hallmark. "Miss Marple," she greeted her, her voice thin but polite. "I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for disturbing you, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said calmly, "but I believe we need to talk. There are questions I've been meaning to ask about your husband and Lillian, Farnsworth's father." Mrs. Darby's face tightened, but she motioned for Miss Marple to sit. "What more is there to say?" she asked quietly. "You know as well as I do that everything has been said. The past is the past." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Past is never truly the past, Mrs. Darby. It always catches up with us in one form or another, and it seems that it has come back to you." Mrs. Darby's lips quivered slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered as she continued. "Lillian's father didn't die of natural causes, did he? You and your husband were involved. Can now, Lillian's return has stirred up what you've worked so hard to bury." The silence in the room was thick, the air heavy with the weight of Miss Marple's words. Mrs. Darby opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. For the first time in Miss Marple's presence, she was speechless. It was then that Miss Marple knew there was no more room for denial. The truth was coming out. It would come from Mrs. Darby herself. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly, her voice the calm before the storm, "it's time to tell me everything." And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. ChatGPT said. Chapter 05. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably as Mrs. Darby stared at Miss Marple, her lips pressed tightly together. The years of secrets, lies, and deception hung between them like a heavy curtain. It was a moment of reckoning, one that Mrs. Darby had clearly been avoiding for years. But the truth, as always, had a way of finding its way to the surface. Miss Marple sat calmly, her gaze unwavering. She had seen this reaction before: the hesitation, the denial, the urge to cling to a past that no longer held any power. But she knew that Mrs. Darby had no choice but to face the truth now. And Miss Marple, ever patient, was prepared to wait. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby began, her voice thin and cracked with emotion. "You don't understand. There are things I've done that can never be undone." Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Darby, but the truth, however painful, is the only way to move forward. Keeping it hidden will only destroy you in the end." Mrs. Darby shook her head slowly, her fingers trembling as she gripped the armrest of her chair. "I didn't want it to go this far. I never wanted anyone to be hurt. But when Lillian's father started asking questions, I knew we couldn't let him find out. We couldn't risk it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. What was it that he found out, Mrs. Darby? What was so dangerous that it had to be hidden at all costs? Mrs. Darby closed her eyes, as though gathering the strength to speak. It wasn't just about money. It was power. It's a kind of power that my late husband and I had spent years building. We were in a position of influence in this village. Everyone trusted us. Lillian's father had a file that could have exposed everything. He knew something we couldn't let him reveal. Miss Marple's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. She had suspected as much Lillian's father had discovered something critical, something so important that it would have undone the Darby family's carefully cultivated position in the village. But what was in that file? What could possibly have been so damning? Miss Marple said softly, "You decided to kill him." Mrs. Darby flinched at the words, her face paling even further. "Yes," she whispered. "We didn't have a choice. My husband was involved, and when Lillian's father started putting the pieces together, we couldn't let him go on. We had to make it look like a natural death, a heart attack, something plausible, and it worked. But the cost of that lie, ... Her voice trailed off, and she sank back in her chair, her hands covering her face as though she could shield herself from the weight of her confession. Miss Marple sat in silence, allowing the woman to absorb the enormity of what she had just said. It was clear that Mrs. Darby had been carrying this burden for a long time. The guilt was written all over her face, and though she had tried to maintain control for years, she had finally been cornered by her own actions. The truth had come out, and it had shattered the facade that Mrs. Darby had worked so hard to build. You never wanted it to go this far, Miss Marple said quietly, but it did. And now, everything you've tried to protect is unraveling. Lillian's return wasn't an accident. She came back because she knew something was wrong. Back because she wanted justice. Mrs. Darby's eyes filled with tears, but she did not speak. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair, her knuckles white as she tried to hold herself together. Miss Marple waited patiently, giving her the space to come to terms with the truth. Miss Farnsworth has left the village, Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but resolute. But she hasn't given up. She has left behind something that will reveal the rest of the story. The file, the one her father had, is still out there. And when it's found, everything will be exposed. Mrs. Darby's eyes widened in alarm, her voice shaking. The file. But if she finds it, if anyone finds it, everything will come out. My husband, everything we've worked for it, will all be destroyed. That's the price of secrets, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. When you hide the truth, you think you're protecting yourself, but in the end, it's the truth that protects you. The longer you hold on to it, the more damage it does. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging in the air. Mrs. Darby's hands were still trembling, but she no longer looked defiant. Instead, she looked small, broken by the enormity of what she had done, and the consequences that were now inevitable. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. You may have been protecting yourself, Mrs. Darby, but in the end, it's the people who are left behind who suffer. Lillian's return wasn't just about exposing your secret, Sid. It was about giving her father the justice he was denied. Mrs. Darby looked up, her face contorted with emotion. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant for anyone to die. But someone did, Miss Marple said gently. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice. The truth will come out, one way or another. For the first time since the conversation began, Mrs. Darby looked directly at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with resignation. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come. She had hoped that the years of silence and denial would protect her, but the truth had finally caught up with her. "I will face it," Mrs. Darby whispered. "I'll face whatever comes. Spent too many years hiding from the past, and I can't do it anymore." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's never too late to make things right. But you can't do it alone. You must speak to Lillian, to the village. The truth must come from you, not from someone else." The older woman nodded, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her confession. "I will. I'll speak to her. I'll tell her everything." Miss Marple stood, her heart heavy but resolute. "Good. It's the only way to begin to atone for what's been done. But remember, Mrs. Darby, the truth doesn't just set you free, it sets everyone free." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she paused at the door, glancing back at the woman who had once held so much power over the village. Mrs. Darby was sitting quietly now, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, as though she were preparing herself for what was to come. Miss Marple's heart was heavy, but she knew that justice, though delayed, was finally on its way. The truth had been unearthed, and now, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Mrs. Darby would face the consequences, and the village of St. Mary Mead would finally begin to heal as Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening air. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The mystery had been solved. The truth had been exposed, and now the world would begin to turn against secrets no longer hidden behind closed doors. The next morning, thick fog had rolled over St. Mary Mead, blanketing the village in a shroud of mist. The quiet murmur of the village seemed muffled, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the fog curl around the edges of the cottages and down the narrow lanes. And for the first time in days, she felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The truth, though long buried, was now coming to light. Mrs. Darby's confession had been a crucial step, but it was not the end. Miss Marple knew the village would not easily accept what had been done. The damage caused by years of silence, deceit, and murder would take time to heal. The Darby family's fall from grace would be swift, and the villagers, though shocked, would eventually come to see the depth of the lies that had been told. But for Miss Marple, the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. Mrs. Darby's confession had shed light on her role in the death of Lillian Farnsworth's father, but it had not answered all the questions. What exactly had Lillian discovered, and why had she left the village in such a hurry? After breakfast, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her mind turning over the details. The streets were eerily quiet, with most people likely still recovering from the shock of Mrs. Darby's collapse and the subsequent revelations. She passed the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air, but the usual cheerfulness of the shopkeeper was absent. The jovial chatter of the villagers was gone, replaced by a somber atmosphere. Everyone was waiting for the next step in this unfolding drama. Miss Marple knew that it was time to bring everything to a head. Miss Marple made her way to the Darby estate once again. But this time, she was not expecting a conversation with Mrs. Darby alone. She had learned everything she needed from the woman. What she needed now was the final piece proof that everything Mrs. Darby had confessed was true, and to finally confront Lillian Farnsworth, who had remained silent, but whose actions had spoken volumes. As Miss Marple approached the estate, she could see the familiar figure of Constable Hawkins standing at the entrance. His face a mixture of uncertainty and frustration. He was clearly waiting for someone in Miss Marple's sharp eyes could tell that he had been up all night. "Good morning, Constable." Miss Marple greeted him as she approached. Hawkins looked up, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and surprise. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you're here. There's been more news. You were right all along, about everything?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "I'm glad to hear that, Constable. What has happened?" "The Darby estate," Hawkins began, his voice low. "They've found something. We've been searching the manor, going through Mrs. Darby's papers, and we found the file. The one that Miss Farnsworth's father was trying to protect. The one that could have destroyed the Darbys." Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had suspected this for days, but now, hearing it confirmed, she could feel the tension rising. The file was the key. If they had finally found it, the full truth would come to light. "Where is it now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. "We've secured it in the office," Hawkins replied, "but we haven't gone through it completely yet. I think it's time we confront Mrs. Darby with what we know. And I think it's time we find Lillian. If she knows more, we need to hear it from her directly." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working ahead. "I agree. But before we confront Mrs. Darby, we must ensure that the file is in our hands. I believe it will hold the final piece to this puzzle. It's not just about the murder anymore, it's about everything that led up to it, about the power, the control, and the lies that have kept this village in the dark for so long." Hawkins looked at Miss Marple, his face hardening with determination. "I'll make sure it's secure, but we need to be careful. Okay, this is bigger than just a simple murder. It's about the very fabric of this village, and what happens now could change everything." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, filled with the quiet strength that had always defined her. "Indeed, Constable. And that's exactly why we can't let anyone else control this story. We have to bring the truth into the light, no matter what it costs." They entered the house together, and Hawkins led the way to the study, where the file had been secured. The room was still, heavy with the weight of the discoveries made over the point. Past few days, the air smelled of dust and old books, and Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding. The village had long been a place of calm, of order, but now, with the final pieces of the story falling into place, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Hawkins opened the drawer of the desk, and Miss Marple's eyes immediately fell on the worn file inside. It was thick with papers, yellowed with age, and it was clear that it had been carefully preserved, perhaps for this very moment. Hawkins slid it across the table to her, and she opened it with care. Inside, Miss Marple found a collection of documents, letters, notes, and photographs that told the story of a much darker past than anyone in St. Mary Mead had ever known. The evidence was damning. It outlined the hidden wealth of the Darby family, the illegal dealings that had been carefully masked, and the steps taken to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their control. It was clear now that Mrs. Darby and her late husband had been involved in far more than anyone had suspected, and Lillian's father had uncovered it all. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the documents quickly, her mind processing the information as she pieced together the story that had been hidden for so long. The Darbys had used their influence to cover up a series of financial scandals, but when Lillian's father had stumbled upon the truth, they had to act. The murder had been a means to silence him, and the village had been complicit in the silence that followed. "I think we have enough," Miss Marple said quietly, closing the file and standing up. "It's time to confront Mrs. Darby, and it's time to find Lillian." Hawkins nodded, his face grim. "I'll get the officers ready." Quote, "I don't know where Lillian could be. She's vanished without a trace." Miss Marple looked out the window, her mind turning over the clues. "She's not gone, Constable. Not yet. She's still in the village, waiting to finish what she started. And when we find her, the final chapter of this story will be written." Together, they made their way to Mrs. Darby's study, where the final confrontation awaited. The truth, at last, would come to light, and St. Mary Mead would never be the same again. Tools, CHIP TR06. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead was thick with anticipation. The fog from the morning had lifted, but the village still felt shrouded in an air of unease. Miss Marple, though calm on the outside, felt a ripple of tension run through her as she made her way back to the Darby estate with Constable Hawkins. The pieces were finally in place, but the truth, once revealed, would forever alter the course of the village's history. They arrived at the estate just as the afternoon sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds. The manor stood like an imposing fortress, its stone walls seeming to whisper the secrets of generations that had been carefully kept behind closed doors. Tension in the air was palpable, as if the very walls of the house were waiting for the inevitable confrontation. As they entered the drawing room, Miss Marple's mind raced. The truth was at hand, but it was not just Mrs. Darby who needed to be confronted. It was the entire system of lies, manipulation, and greed that had held this village captive for so long. Mrs. Darby's confession had been the key to unlocking the mystery, but now it was time to see how deep the deception truly ran. Mrs. Darby was sitting by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, as though trying to maintain the composed facade she had so carefully constructed over the years. Her once pristine appearance now seemed fragile, as though the weight of her own guilt had stripped her of the power she once held over the village. The lines on her face were deeper than Miss Marple remembered, and her eyes, once sharp and calculating, now seemed clouded with uncertainty. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon, What more is there to discuss? I've already confessed to everything I know." Miss Marple sat across from her, her gaze unwavering. "There is still more, Mrs. Darby. Your confession was a beginning, but it is not the whole story. There is still the matter of what your husband and you were protecting, what you've spent years keeping hidden." Mrs. Darby's face flushed slightly, and she shifted in her seat, the tension in her posture betraying her calm facade. "I told you everything I could. What more do you want from me?" "Everything," Miss Marple replied softly, her voice laced with quiet authority. "You were involved in more than just your husband's affairs. You were part of a system that had its roots in more than just financial gain. What you and your late husband did was not just about hiding money, it was about protecting power, And when Lillian Farnsworth's father uncovered that, you took steps to make sure that no one would ever know the truth." Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered, the faintest hint of fear crossing her face before she regained control. "I didn't kill him. It wasn't my fault." "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "It wasn't, but you allowed it to happen. You turned a blind eye because it suited you. Your husband's ambitions, his desire for control, led to a murder, and you were complicit. You knew it was coming, right? And you made sure the rest of the village remained silent. You buried the truth, not because you had to, but because you were afraid of what would happen if anyone found out." Mrs. Darby stared at her, her mouth slightly open as if searching for words, but none came. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of the confession she had yet to fully acknowledge. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever, Mrs. Darby," she said softly. "It has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how hard we try to conceal it." At that moment, the door opened quietly, and Hawkins stepped into the room. He nodded at Miss Marple, signaling that everything was in place. She gave him a small nod in return and turned back to Mrs. Darby, who had grown more withdrawn, her hands now trembling slightly in her lap. "You knew that Lillian's return would stir everything up," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but piercing. "You knew that if she found out the truth, everything would unravel. That's why you've been so anxious, so desperate to hide. You've spent years controlling this village, keeping everyone in line with your charm and your wealth. But it's all been a lie, hasn't it? The words hit Mrs. Darby like a slap, and she winced visibly, as though the truth stung more than she had expected. I never wanted this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I never wanted any of this to happen. Okay. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze focused and intent. But it did happen, Mrs. Darby, and now it's time for the truth to come out. Lillian has left the village, but not for the reasons you think. She knows more than you realize. She's uncovered what you've been hiding, and soon the rest of the village will know the full story. The truth will be exposed. Mrs. Darby swallowed hard, the color draining from her face, as she finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. If the truth comes out, it will destroy everything. My family, everything we built it, will be gone. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. What you built, Mrs. Darby, was built on lies. The truth will set you free, but it will also bring justice. Lillian's father was denied justice, and now it's time for that wrong to be righted. The room fell silent again, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Mrs. Darby sat motionless, her eyes staring into the fire as though trying to avoid facing the inevitable. She had spent so many years pretending that her past didn't matter, that the secrets she kept hidden were harmless. But Miss Marple knew better, and now the truth was finally coming to light. At that moment, a sharp knock came at the door, interrupting the stillness. Hawkins stepped forward again, this time with a different expression on his face. Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. We found her, Lillian Farnsworth. She's at the village church. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she stood, a sense of finality settling over her. I knew it, she said quietly. She hasn't given up. She's found something, and she's come back to finish what she started. Mrs. Darby looked up, her face pale. No, please. Don't let her come here. It will ruin everything. It's already ruined, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice firm but not unkind. The truth is unstoppable, and it's time for you to face it. As Miss Marple and Hawkins left the room, the sense of inevitability grew. The final confrontation was at hand. The truth would be exposed, and St. Mary Mead would never be the same again. Miss Marple's steps were steady as she made her way toward the church, her mind already on the confrontation to come. Lillian Farnsworth, after everything, had returned to finish what her father had started. And Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the end. The past had finally caught up with St. Mary Mead, and now nothing would stop the truth from coming to light. Tools as Miss Marple and Constable Hawkins made their way to the village church. The air seemed to grow colder, the fog rolling back over the landscape as if the very village were holding its breath. It was a familiar feeling, one that Miss Marple had experienced many times in her long career of solving mysteries. The final moments were always the hardest, when everything came to a head, when the truth was poised to spill into the open, threatening to change everything. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust in the process. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. No matter how deep it had been buried, the church loomed ahead, its tall spire cutting through the mist like a silent sentinel, guarding secrets and stories that spanned centuries. As they approached the heavy wooden doors, Miss Marple could feel the weight of history pressing in on her. This village, this quiet little world, had been turned upside down in just a few short days. Mrs. Darby's confession had sent shockwaves through the village. And now, with Lillian Farnsworth's return, the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. The door creaked open as they entered, and the familiar smell of incense and polished wood filled the air. The church was silent, save for the faint rustling of pages as someone turned them in the back pew. There, near the altar, sat Lillian Farnsworth. Her head bent low in deep thought, the lines of her face sharp and determined. She looked almost like a figure out of a dream, alone in the hushed sacredness of the church, as though she had come here to face something greater than herself. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she approached, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. Constable Hawkins remained near the door, giving them space. Miss Marple had always known that Lillian was determined, but the intensity of her presence now, in this moment, told Miss Marple that she had come to a decision, one that would change everything. Miss Farnsworth. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but firm, drawing Lillian's attention. Lillian slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a mixture of weariness and something else, something resolute. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I wondered when you would find me." "I'm afraid the truth has a way of finding people, Miss Farnsworth," Miss Marple replied, her voice filled with the quiet authority that only experience could provide. "And once it does, it doesn't let go until everything is revealed." Lillian's gaze darkened for a moment, and Miss Marple could see the weight of years of hidden truths and buried memories reflected in her eyes. "You're right," Lillian said, her voice low. "I've spent my entire life trying to avoid it, trying to move past it. But now I can't run from it anymore." Miss Marple sat beside her, her tone gentle but insistent. "You've come back for a reason, Miss Farnsworth. I know you've discovered something that connects your father's death to everything that's happening now. The truth has always been close, hasn't it?" Lillian exhaled, a deep breath that seemed to carry all the sorrow and frustration of the past. She nodded slowly. "I never wanted to come back to this place. I left all those years ago because I couldn't bear it. The shame, the fear of what everyone would think. But I couldn't stay away forever. My father deserves justice, and the Darby family. They need to be held accountable for what they did." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. "The Darbys are at the center of this, yes, but it's not just them. There are others who have been complicit in the silence and the lies that have protected them for so long." Lillian turned toward Miss Marple, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I know, I've been searching for answers, and I've found pieces of the puzzle. But there's something I don't understand, something I've only just begun to see." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but urgent. "What do you mean?" Lillian hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the pew. "I've been looking for the file, the one my father kept, the one that had all the answers. I thought it was just about the money, about the Darby's wealth, and how they'd covered everything up. But there's more. I think my father uncovered something even bigger, something that involves the entire village." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's mind raced. Lillian had discovered more than she had let on she had uncovered, a deeper conspiracy, one that threatened to shake the very foundations of St. Mary Mead. "What exactly did your father find?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but filled with quiet urgency. Lillian's face twisted with frustration as she stared at the church's altar. "It's all connected, Miss Marple. The Darbys were involved in illegal dealings, sure, but my father found evidence that the village itself was complicit. Some of the wealth they accumulated came from things that were much darker than anyone realized. I think they were using their power over the village, over people's lives, to cover up something much worse. And when my father started getting too close, when he started asking too many questions, they had him silenced." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The realization was dawning, and that is why Mrs. Darby went to such lengths to protect her family. She said softly, her mind piecing together the puzzle. She wasn't just trying to save herself. She was trying to protect a much deeper secret, a secret that the entire village was a part of. Lillian nodded, her face hardening. I think my father had discovered something so damaging that it would have destroyed everything. The Darbys were willing to kill for it. They killed him to keep it hidden. The pieces were finally falling into place. The murder of Lillian's father was not just a personal tragedy, it was part of something much larger. The Darby family had been part of a far-reaching scheme, using their position to control and manipulate, to secure wealth and power through any means necessary. And when Lillian's father had begun to dig into the truth, he had become a threat that had to be eliminated. Miss Marple looked at Lillian with a deep understanding. You knew, even before you came back, that the truth would lead you to this point. But now, we must finish what your father started. Darbys will no longer be able to hide behind their lies. Lillian stood abruptly, her eyes filled with determination. I'm going to confront them. I've been running for too long, and now it's time to face them. I won't stop until I get the answers. Miss Marple stood as well, her voice calm and resolute. We will face them together, Miss Farnsworth. But remember, it's not just about confronting them. It's about bringing the truth to light. The village must know what has been done, and they must be made to understand that they were complicit in the silence. As they walked toward the door, Miss Marple's mind was already racing with the next steps. The truth was no longer something to be whispered about in dark corners. It was out in the open, and now the entire village would have to reckon with it. The confrontation was inevitable, but Miss Marple knew that it would be one of her most difficult. The Darby family's hold on St. Mary Mead was powerful, but truth, as always, would prevail. The air outside the church was cooler than before, and the mist had started to lift. St. Mary Mead, for all its beauty and quiet, had become a battleground, and Miss Marple, as always, would be there to see it through. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. It always did, ChatGPT said. Chapter 07. The following days in St. Mary Mead felt like an unraveling of time itself. The village, once a bastion of quietude, was now on the cusp of something irrevocable. Miss Marple had spent countless hours considering every piece of the puzzle, each moment contributing to the crescendo of truth that was finally emerging. The fog that had once shrouded the village had lifted, both literally and figuratively. But the final confrontation loomed large. Lillian Farnsworth's return had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. Miss Marple knew that the Darby family's control over the village had been built on lies, manipulation, and secrecy. And now, with the discovery of the hidden file, the revelations from Mrs. Darby's confession, and Lillian's relentless pursuit of the truth, the layers of deception were beginning to peel away. The evening before their final confrontation with Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple had a quiet moment to reflect. She sat by the fire in her cottage, a mug of tea in hand, her thoughts swirling around everything that had led them to this point. Mrs. Darby's admission had been a crucial turning point, but Miss Marple was well aware that the truth could still be a dangerous thing to confront. The Darbys were powerful figures in the village, and though their empire was crumbling, they would not go down easily. The next morning, Miss Marple met with Constable Hawkins at the village square. He looked more composed than he had in days, though the tension in his posture betrayed his unease. The final confrontation with the Darbys was imminent, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of it pressing against her. Miss Marple, Hawkins greeted her, his voice firm but strained. I've been speaking with the officers. We've got everything ready for Mrs. Darby, but I can't help but feel that something is missing. Something still doesn't sit right with me. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and discerning. What do you mean? Hawkins paused, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. It's just ... Lillian. I know she's found something in that file, something her father discovered, but she's left the village without a word. What if she's gone too far? What if she's in danger? Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. Hawkins's concerns were valid. Lillian had always been a determined woman, but now, in the wake of everything she had uncovered, her resolve had only hardened. The question was whether the Darbys or others connected to them would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. I believe Lillian is exactly where she needs to be, Miss Marple said gently. She has taken a calculated risk, but she knows more than anyone the dangers she faces. If she has gone to confront the Darbys, then she has done so because she has uncovered something crucial. But we must ensure that we are ready for whatever comes next. Hawkins nodded, though his expression remained tense. And if we can't find her before Mrs. Darby speaks, if the Darbys have hidden their secrets too well, Miss Marple's gaze hardened with determination. The truth is already in motion, Constable, okay? And when it comes, it will sweep everything in its path. No one can hide from the truth forever. With that, they set off toward the Darby estate. As they approached the manor, the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Miss Marple could see the house from a distance, its imposing facade standing like a fortress against the skyline. The gates, once wide open, now seemed closed off, as though the house itself were preparing for a final stand. Miss Marple, Hawkins said quietly, breaking her concentration. Do you think we're doing the right thing, confronting her? It feels like we're about to stir up a hornet's nest. So Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression calm but resolute. Sometimes, Constable, it's necessary to stir the nest. Only then can the truth come out. Mrs. Darby has spent her life hiding behind her power, but the time for that is over. She must answer for her actions, and so must everyone who has been complicit. They arrived at the door, and Miss Marple knocked gently, but with the kind of deliberate intent that made it clear she would not be turned away. The door opened slowly, and the same housekeeper who had greeted them before stood before them. Her face pale and strained. Miss Marple, she said, her voice low. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Darby. She's waiting for you, but she's not in any condition to talk. She's been very ill, and I don't think I understand, Miss Marple said gently, stepping past her. But I'm afraid there's no time to waste. Mrs. Darby must speak, and it must be now. The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, silently guiding them to the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was sitting by the fire, her back turned to them. She appeared frail and smaller than Miss Marple had remembered, her once imposing figure diminished by the weight of her own guilt. The years of lies and manipulation had clearly taken their toll. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady. It's time to face the truth. Mrs. Darby turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. You've come to confront me then? She said, her voice hoarse. I thought this day would come, but I never imagined it would be like this. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression calm but resolute. You've spent so many years hiding behind your wealth, your power, and your lies, but no more. It's time for the truth to come to light. Mrs. Darby shook her head, her hands trembling in her lap. I tried to protect everyone. I tried to protect my family, my reputation. But now I see it's all for nothing. I can't escape what I've done. Miss Marple's gaze softened. No one can escape the truth, Mrs. Darby. You may have hidden it for a time, but now it's time to face the consequences of your actions. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them. Mrs. Darby's eyes were filled with a mix of sorrow and fear, but Miss Marple could see that she was finally beginning to come to terms with the reality of what she had done. It wasn't just about the money, Mrs. Darby whispered, her voice cracking. It was about control. It was about keeping this village under my thumb, keeping the truth buried so no one would ever question us. But Lillian, Key was too smart. she uncovered everything. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Darby. And now, it's time for the village to know what you've done. The lies can't be hidden any longer. The truth is out, and it will spread like wildfire. The air in the room felt thick with tension, and Miss Marple knew that they were on the brink of something that would change everything. The confrontation had begun, but the real test was yet to come. The revelation of everything that had been hidden for so long, the reckoning that would follow. As Miss Marple prepared to speak again, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most important part of the story had yet to unfold. The truth was close, but someone somewhere was still pulling the strings, waiting for the moment when everything would finally collapse. And Miss Marple knew that when the final thread was pulled, it would unravel everything. The quiet tension in the room seemed to stretch on forever, hanging in the air like a cloud of smoke waiting to dissipate. Mrs. Darby sat rigidly by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple stood before her, her mind racing through the pieces of the puzzle, ready for the final act. Hawkins, still standing by the door, was visibly tense, though his gaze remained steady. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said gently, her voice low but firm. You've spent years hiding from the truth, but you can't do it any longer. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how much we try to keep it in the dark. And now, the village will know what's been hidden all these years. The older woman, whose demeanor had once been so formidable, now seemed frail and broken, as though the weight of her own guilt had stripped her of her power. She glanced up at Miss Marple, her face pale, eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow, fear, and a kind of reluctant acceptance. I never wanted this, Mrs. Darby whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought I could control everything, keep everything quiet. But now I see ... It was always going to come to this. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening slightly. You tried to protect your family, your position, and the secrets that have kept this village in the dark. But now, it's time for everyone to know the truth. Mrs. Darby's hands trembled, and she slowly raised her eyes to meet Miss Marple's. I was just trying to keep things from falling apart, she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't let everything my husband and I built be destroyed. But in the end, I see that I've only made it worse. I've ruined everything. Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate step toward her, her eyes unwavering. What happened with your husband, Mrs. Darby? You said your family was protecting something more than just money. What was it? Mrs. Darby closed her eyes, her face tightening with pain. We weren't just hiding money, Miss Marple. We were hiding power control over this village, over the land, over everyone in it. My husband was involved in something much darker than anyone knew that he was involved in. Illegal dealings. But it was more than that. It was about keeping people under our thumb, controlling everything that happened in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's heart quickened, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. And when Lillian's father began to ask questions, you and your husband couldn't let him expose the truth, so you killed him. Mrs. Darby flinched, as though the words stung her. She nodded slowly, her face drawn. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, but when he found the evidence of the file, he had to be silenced. We couldn't let him ruin everything. The murder, it was a last resort. But once we did it, there was no turning back. Your husband was involved in this illegal enterprise, and you helped cover it up, Miss Marple said softly, her voice laced with sorrow. You both chose to protect your power over the truth, but now, that truth has caught up with you. Mrs. Darby nodded, her expression crumpling as the weight of her actions finally sank in. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but when it was all on the line, I did what I thought was necessary. I thought I could control it all, but now it's too late. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind turning over the full scope of the situation. And when Lillian returned to the village, You knew she would uncover everything. You knew that her questions would threaten to expose everything you had tried so hard to bury. Mrs. Darby's lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed as though she might speak. But instead, she fell silent, her face crumpling in a mixture of regret and fear. "I didn't know what to do," she murmured. "I thought I could stop it, that I could bury everything and keep it hidden. But now I see that it's all falling apart." The room seemed to close in around them, the weight of the secrets that had been buried for so long, pressing down on everyone present. Miss Marple stood there, watching Mrs. Darby's breakdown with a quiet, composed resolve. The woman was finally confronting the reality of her actions, but it was clear that her confession would not be enough to undo the damage she had caused. "What is in the file, Mrs. Darby?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice soft but insistent. "What did your husband and you try so desperately to hide?" The older woman swallowed hard, as though summoning the last of her strength. "It's all in there. The money, the land deals, the people my husband was connected to. But there's something else, something more dangerous. Dan, my husband had connections with people outside the village, people who could have destroyed everything if the truth came out. They were involved in something far bigger than just St. Mary Mead. And when my husband died, I took the file and kept it hidden, hoping no one would ever find it." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind racing. "Who else is involved in this, Mrs. Darby? Who else is tied to your family's empire?" Mrs. Darby shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "I can't say. Don't know who would come after me, but I know they're out there. They've always been out there." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice firm. "The people who were involved, Mrs. Darby, have been hiding for too long, Cal. But now they will have to face the consequences of their actions. This village cannot remain silent anymore." Just as Miss Marple finished speaking, Hawkins entered the room again, his face taut with urgency. "Miss Marple, there's something you need to see. We found more." The filet wasn't just about money or power. There are letters, too, and they name names. Mrs. Darby's face went pale, and she suddenly seemed smaller, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her guilt. I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. Miss Marple turned to Hawkins, her voice low. "Where is it?" "In the study," Hawkins replied. "There's more evidence, more connections to people outside the village. It's all there. Think it's time we finally bring everything to light." The tension in the room was palpable. Miss Marple could feel the gravity of what was to come. This was no longer just about Mrs. Darby's actions. It was about the entire village. The truth, at long last, was coming to light. But with it came the responsibility of exposing everything, the people, the lies, and the dark secrets that had bound St. Mary Mead in silence for so long. As they made their way to the study, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. She had known that this moment would come, that the truth would eventually out. But now, standing on the precipice of the final revelation, she felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve. This village, this quiet world she had come to know so well, would never be the same again, and the consequences of what had been done would ripple outward, changing lives forever. But for Miss Marple, the mission had always been clear. The truth must be uncovered, no matter the cost. And now, at last, that truth was within reach. It was time for St. Mary Mead to face the reckoning that had been a long time coming. The study was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the bright sunlight of the afternoon. The air in the room felt thick, charged with a tension that had been building for days. As Miss Marple, Hawkins, and Mrs. Darby stepped inside, the enormity of the situation seemed to hang in the air, each breath a step closer to the inevitable confrontation. The walls of the study, lined with books and documents, now felt oppressive, as though they had absorbed the weight of the secrets hidden within. Hawkins approached the desk where the file lay open, its pages scattered across the surface. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she scanned the contents, each piece of paper revealing new layers of the web of deceit that had entangled the village for so long. The file was thicker than she had anticipated, each page filled with letters, financial records, and names that connected the Darby family to people far beyond St. Mary Mead, people whose influence and power could reach into the darkest corners of society. "Is this everything?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady as she looked at Hawkins. Her mind was already racing, piecing together the information with the same precision that had served her well throughout her career. There was a finality to the moment, a sense of resolve that filled the room. Hawkins nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple, it's all here. The letters, the transactions, the connections to figures, and London people who were never supposed to be tied to this village. Your suspicions were right. Mrs. Darby and her husband were involved in much more than just local corruption. They were part of a larger network, one that had its fingers in illegal dealings, extortion, and manipulation. Mrs. Darby, who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly. She seemed smaller now, defeated by the weight of her own actions. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice hollow. "I never thought it would be like this. I thought we could control it. I'll keep it hidden." Miss Marple turned toward her, her expression softening. "Control is an illusion, Mrs. Darby. You can hide things for a time, but the truth always comes out, and when it does, it's always more powerful than the lies." Mrs. Darby closed her eyes, her face crumpling as the full weight of her guilt seemed to crush her. "I didn't know how to stop it," she whispered. "I thought I could protect my family, but now, I see what it's cost." Miss Marple placed a hand on the edge of the desk, her fingers brushing over the documents, as though feeling the gravity of the lives they had touched. "You protected your family by lying, Mrs. Darby, but now you must face the consequences of those lies." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint rustle of paper as Miss Marple turned a page, her mind processing the information with deliberate calm. Each new revelation was another step toward the truth, the final piece of the puzzle that had eluded the village for so long. Finally, Miss Marple stood, her eyes focused on the file before her. "It's more than just a story of greed and corruption. This is about power, how it's used, how it's abused, and how it corrupts everything it touches. The Darby family may have tried to control this village for years, but in the end, it's the truth that will set St. Mary Mead free." Hawkins stepped forward, his expression firm. "What happens now, Miss Marple? We can't keep this hidden any longer. We need to bring everything to the authorities, expose the network they were part of." Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes steady. "Yes, but first, we must confront the village itself. They need to understand what's been going on, how they've been complicit in allowing this to continue. The truth doesn't just affect the people who were involved directly. It affects everyone. We all play a part, even if we don't realize it." Mrs. Darby, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke again. "And what about Lillian? Where is she?" "She's the one who started all of this." Miss Marple paused, her gaze turning to the window as though searching for answers in the fog that had returned to the village. "Lillian has done more than anyone could have hoped. She's uncovered the truth, and she's done it on her terms. But she knows as well as I do that the work is not over yet. She may have left the village, but her presence is still here. The legacy of her father's death, the lives ruined by the lies, all of it has to be confronted." Silence in the room deepened as Miss Marple looked at Hawkins, her gaze sharp. "We need to gather the villagers, all of them. It's time to lay everything bare. They need to hear the truth directly from us." Hawkins nodded, understanding the gravity of what Miss Marple was asking. "I'll get word to the others. will hold a meeting in the square. But I'll warn you, Miss Marple, not everyone will be ready for what's about to come out. Miss Marple turned back to Mrs. Darby, her expression softening. I'm sorry, Mrs. Darby. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. The village needs to know what's been done, and they need to understand how their silence allowed it to continue. Mrs. Darby looked down at the desk, her face a portrait of resignation. I know, I've spent my life building a reputation on lies, but now it's time to face the consequences. I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them the truth. The weight of those words hung in the air like a final bell tolling. Miss Marple knew that what would come next would be difficult for everyone, but it was necessary. The village of St. Mary Mead had been complicit in keeping the secrets of the Darby family for far too long. The truth would be the reckoning both for Mrs. Darby and for the village that had turned a blind eye for so many years. As they left the study and made their way toward the village square, Miss Marple felt the full weight of the task ahead. The truth would not be easy to bear, but it was the only path forward. And in the end, the truth was always the final victory. The fog had begun to lift as they reached the square, and Miss Marple stood in the center, looking out at the gathered villagers. They were confused, uncertain, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. But Miss Marple's steady gaze made it clear. The time had come. The village would face the truth, and together, they would have to reckon with the lies that had been buried for so long. The moment of revelation had arrived. The past could no longer be hidden. And as the villagers stood before her, Miss Marple knew that this moment would forever change the fabric of St. Mary Mead. The truth would set them free, but only if they were ready to hear it. Miss Marple cleared her throat and began to speak. Her voice calm, but filled with the authority of a woman who had seen more of life's darkest secrets than most could ever imagine. Ladies and gentlemen of St. Mary Mead, she said, her words carrying over the crowd. It's time for the truth to come to light. And with that, the village was no longer the same. The lies were finished. The reckoning had begun. Tools ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.